This evening we have guest from overseas, Dr. Linford Fisher, and we hope to have an intellectually engaging book talk by him. So enjoy, and afterwards please socialize. We are going to have beverages and some snacks downstairs in the museum. So mill about, socialize, introduce yourselves, and enjoy. Once again, thank you and welcome.
Good evening. My name is Malachi Sinsuchi Smith, and I'm currently a student at Bermuda College. Currently studying liberal arts, the Arab concentration in history, hopefully to take up a master's degree in archives and records management. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's author. Dr. Linford Fisher, Associate Professor of History at Brown University and one of the foremost scholars of Native American history in colonial America and the Atlantic world. Dr. Fisher grew up in southeastern Pennsylvania in a region shaped by Amish and Mennonite traditions. That early exposure to distinctive religious and cultural communities helped spark an interest in the histories of peoples whose stories are often overlooked or misunderstood. Over the course of his career, he has become a leading voice in uncovering a chapter of history that for many years received far too little attention: the enslavement and forced migration of indigenous peoples throughout the Atlantic world. Through his scholarship in the Stolen Relations Project, Dr. Fisher has documented how Native Americans captured during conflicts, such as King Philip's War in the 1670s, were sold into slavery and transported to places including Bermuda, Barbados, Jamaica, and beyond. This history has particular significance for Bermuda. Many native captives from New England were brought here, where they became part of Bermuda's population and contributed to the island's rich and complex cultural heritage. Dr. Fisher's work has helped illuminate these connections and deepen our understanding of Bermuda's place within the wider story of indigenous displacement, survival, and resilience across the Atlantic. Tonight, he will share insights from years of research into these histories and their continuing relevance today. Please join me in giving a warm Bermuda welcome to Dr. Linford Fisher.
Thank you. Remember your first name again? Malachi. Malachi? Yeah. Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for the warm welcome. Thanks to Malachi for the introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here, to see so many friendly and familiar faces and new faces as well. Can you hear me in the back okay? I don't know how loud I have to be. So if you can't hear me, wave your hands. You can't hear me, okay? I will try even harder. So I just want to say thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be back here. Bermuda is one of my favorite places to come and to enjoy and to research and to meet with people. And it's always a pleasure to be back in a beautiful space again. Everyone is so kind. The history is complicated. Is it getting better? Can you hear me? Move up. Yeah, there's room in the front. I feel like I'm in a classroom, that my students don't want to be close to me. There's 5, 6 spaces up here if you want to come. Yeah? All right. I want to start, though, just by saying that I am presenting sort of my somewhat limited knowledge from a certain perspective as an academic on these topics. And I recognize this room is full of knowledge keepers and experts in ways that I am not. So I just want to come to you saying, all I can do is share the research I've done, and I really value and appreciate the knowledge and wisdom in this room that has far exceeds mine, and also I think has contributed in different ways to what I want to present on as well, to kind of merge some of the archival histories as well as sort of other pieces of this history too. So I do want to talk about this book that was recently published, but you'll notice something maybe that is less interesting to you, the U.S. history part. So I'll leave most of that out. I will talk a little bit at the end about how this merges with U.S. history, but the first half of the book, even beyond, is really about English colonial history and this wider world that I want to try to describe that Bermuda plays a really important part of. So I will get to that a little bit. We do have copies downstairs. When you get some refreshments, you can get a copy if you want as well. But I also want to recognize that this is International Archives Day. And so the Archives has done an amazing job, if you haven't been over there, to display a lot of the relevant materials from the archives and other sources about some of this history as well. So if you haven't seen it, go there. There's also belongings and physical objects around this room and also downstairs that tell some of the story too. But I hope that Carla won't be too upset if I say that while archives are really important, archives alone, I don't think, can really tell all of these stories. And so part of what I want to do also is just acknowledge the St. David's community and Native community, who are, many of whom are here, but also have done a lot of this work of retaining and recovering these stories, keeping the stories, keeping the histories alive when archives tended to obscure and minimize and erase indigeneity and family histories. And so just to recognize that while I'm going to nerd out a little bit on archives, because it's International Archives Day, that I will come back to this theme again a few times, that the archives, as important as they are never enough. And I think that's something that, Carla, you certainly agree with, and other people in the room as well. But so back to Carla for a second, I just want to also say thank you, because when I first arrived here in 2011, well, we were all much younger then, first of all. But second of all, I came into the archives really green, didn't know exactly what I was looking for, was trying to trace connections with New England, especially the Pequots, as other people had done before, and came to the archives, went downstairs, hung up my stuff, went to the front desk, and this person was there, and I said, hi, I'm here to look for Pequots in the archives, and Carla looked at me and she said, I am Pequot. And I just about fainted because I didn't expect to hear that. But what Carla did, she showed me some stuff in the archives, but she also gave me a list of 10 different people to go talk to. And you might not realize how transformative that was for this project, because from the beginning, it set me off on a dual path of looking in archives and talking to people. And that's been a really powerful part of this process. Super humbling for me, because we're taught and trained that the archive is sort of the almighty. So anyway, just thanks so much for that. It was really, really important. Anyway, so also want to give a shout out to Brinky and Lynn and other people in this room, Ronnie, other people I know who have been helpful and influential and the true knowledge keepers in this room. All right, so I don't need to tell this room, but I'll say it for the video and other people who might not know as well. The images, people you might recognize and know in these images. Ronnie, you're looking good there. So this is from 2018 when I was here to the privilege of attending the powwow. It was really a moving moment, including sort of the launching of the wreaths. And this is Tall Oak Whedon over here on the right, as many of you know, who passed away a couple years ago. Also very influential for all of us, I think, and for the reconnections and for myself personally. But so this reconnection for outsiders raises a question for people of how it is that New England's natives or any native people are on Bermuda, in Bermuda at all. And so that's kind of what I want to unpack a little bit. Much of it will probably be familiar to many of you, but I want to do two intertwining things. Think about this book and the larger history that Bermuda plays a role in, and then also more specifically about Bermuda itself. So that's where we're going. But I do want to introduce, you all know that, but anyway, just for the people in the video who might not know where St. David's is. I also want to first introduce some of the main themes of the book and give a little bit of how I came onto this topic, because it is maybe helpful to think about themes that the book addresses that also are resonant here in Bermuda as well. So I first, I guess the overview here is to think about the framing for the book. So stealing maybe is a strange verbiage for some people, but in this book I'm trying to understand the long history and the interconnected history of both stealing native people and native lands. And especially in places where there was a resident native population, those processes went hand in hand. And the book's title, Stealing America, comes from these early modern maps, which you probably have seen of the Atlantic world, of the Americas, and almost always there's a Native American, an indigenous woman in the corner. It's called the cartouche down there, and surrounded by produce and fruits and so forth. And for me, this image represented both the people and the land. So this America personified in a person. So stealing America is stealing both the people and the land in a way. So that's kind of the framing of the book. The book has its origins in the archives, appropriate for International Archives Day. And in the mid-2000s, I was working my dissertation, and I was looking for, in New England and Connecticut church records, evidence of New England natives, specifically Mohegan and Pequot, taking part in what we call the First Great Awakening of the 1740s, this massive religious revival. And sure enough, I found some, but what I also found repeatedly were Native people being brought before churches for either baptism or membership, sometimes by the ministers themselves. And I don't know, I wasn't really, the scholarship on New England hadn't really come out yet, and I didn't really know why Native people in New England were still servants and slaves in the 1720s, 30s, and 40s. So I set it aside and came back to it after the book was published as the Indian Great Awakening. And as I began to dig a little more in the archives in New England, almost all of the early trails I was following went out into the Caribbean. And so that's what brought me to Bermuda first in 2011, but also the Bahamas and Barbados and Jamaica and the UK National Archives, and just trying to think about this larger system of indigenous slave trading that Bermuda was a part of. But I also was interested in the United States, and so after 1776, I mean, here we are. I know nobody cares here, but in the US right now, the sort of 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the founding of the country is a big deal. But what I was surprised to find is that the history of enslaving Native people and also stealing their land just never stops. Some of the early literature had talked about it kind of dying off in the 18th century, but it continues in the Revolution, it continues after the Revolution. Native people are part of Southern plantations. When Americans colonize West and take California and New Mexico from Mexico, they initiate another huge spike in Native American slavery. So the history never goes away. And I also end the book by looking at boarding schools in the US and also adoption programs, because those are other examples of how the United States and Americans took Native children out of households, both the boarding schools and also for adoption programs, forced adoption programs. And I think there's probably parallels of that in different ways in Bermuda as well. Anyway, so ended up taking a long time, 15 years. It's both Atlantic, but also continental in its scope. And it was hard to write for all kinds of reasons, but I'm glad that people can now engage with it. All right, so just as some brief background, you might recognize this down here. The larger context for Native American slavery is something that scholars have become more and more aware of over the years. So we now estimate as many as 5.5, I think in the book I actually say 6 million Native people in the Americas as a whole between 1492 and 1880, roughly. So that's a lot of people. That is not as many as were trafficked from West Africa, but still is a huge number that we almost have, barely talked about. In North America, there's about 600,000, which is actually about the same number of African captives that were brought to North America, which is kind of mind-blowing. So African slavery grows by biological increase over time in North America, but it's about the same number of African captives brought and sold into slavery as Native Americans enslaved in North America. It's really kind of astonishing. And I also just want to say that you all know this, but this history of indigenous slavery, it's not meant to compete with or edge out the history of African slavery. These are just both really important realities, and to understand them both is really part of the point here in a way for me. So this book tries to tell this history of English-speaking colonies in the United States, and it's the first of its kind to do that. All right, so let me talk about several threads in the book because I think there's lots of resonances with what's happening in Bermuda as well. Throughout, first of all, I tried to use this, as I said before, this framework of stealing to open up a different kind of space to understand the different ways that Native people found themselves in forms of servitude and unfreedom. So often, slavery history focuses on labor and economics and how many pounds of tobacco and how many people were on the plantation. But actually, for indigenous slavery, there's a lot of murkiness. Sometimes it is chattel slavery, sometimes it is for life, sometimes it's just abductions and people disappear, sometimes it's, in North America at least, there's debt slavery. Native people are enslaved because they fall into too much debt or they commit a crime, right? These are all these different ways that Native people can be forced into servitude. And also stealing, as I said before, allows us to understand boarding schools and adoption processes as part of that as well. So that's the one thing, just to think about this in terms of stealing and the space that opens up to talk about this. By the way, this mural, if you've been to Providence, it's this amazing, huge mural that like just shouts to the world about sort of the Narragansett history of the region, which is really powerful. So the second thing is that in the book, I try to connect that stealing people and stealing land are really interrelated processes. So that might not be as relevant immediately in Bermuda, where there wasn't an original Native population, if that makes sense, to steal land from. But if you think about every Native person that was trafficked to Bermuda, helped to destabilize Native communities somewhere else, that then allowed colonizers to steal their land. So it is still connected. But in North America, we see this time and time again. After every colonial war, the Pequot War, King Philip's War, I'll say more about them in a second, there's a huge land rush. People grab the lands because the slavery and sort of murder of Native people allowed colonizers to have more of the land. So it's a really important part of this as well. Third, in this history, there's a repeated targeting of Native women and children. And we see this especially in the English colonies, in other parts, but I think, maybe you see this from Bermuda as well in terms of who's trafficked in. But in New England, Native men are almost always sent out as slaves, and women and children are retained locally in servitude and slavery. So women and children are targeted. They play an important part in this history. But also, it's a real harm to Native communities when you take away women. In matrilineal societies, women are leaders, and they are also the producers of the next generation. So when you take women, you're destabilizing that community and chipping away at the sovereignty and their ability to sort of continue on. Fourth, part of what I try to talk about throughout the whole book is the way in which, again, back to the archives, that there's a lot of erasure and hiddenness of this history due to what one Narragansett scholar, Ella Sekatow, has called documentary genocide, whereby through paper-keeping processes, record-keeping processes, Native people are written out of the record as natives. And we see this in Bermuda. This is actually the example I use for book talks in the US too. It's not just for you guys, because it's such a powerful example. This is a census from 1698 I think it's actually from the UK National Archives, but it would have been a copy sent to the Board of Trade. But if you look, there's two columns, right? Black and white. There's no room to tabulate Indigenous presence and natives in this census. So if you're a historian looking at this, you're like, well, I guess there's no natives in Bermuda, right? But at the same time, even just a couple years earlier, first of all, the governor himself has Jack, an Indian boy, in his possession, right? So we immediately know that the census is wrong. And second of all, there's through the probate inventories, there's whole plantations a couple that only have Native people as slaves on these plantations. So it's a stunning sort of reveal of the lie of the of the official census, right? But this kind of erasure, I think, is why native slavery isn't often taken seriously. It's why claims of indigeneity sometimes aren't taken very seriously. So the more local plantation records tell a more honest story in many different ways, which I think is really powerful. So the fifth thread here is the incredible agency and action of Native people. This happens from the moment Columbus tries to kidnap Taino people, when they fight back and kick and punch and everything else, to the 20th century in the US, when Native leaders petition Congress, they show up in Washington, D.C., they send delegations, they demand their rights. This is a really important thread throughout. And I think the recovery that the St. David's community has done over the years is a part of that agency and resistance as well, not letting the archives have the final story as you go along. Okay, so very quickly, I want to just talk about some broader backgrounds and then get into some documents from Bermuda as well. So one of the things I'm trying to do in this book, which is maybe more relevant for a US context, but I think it has broader ramifications, is to gently suggest that 1619 isn't the start of slavery in what became the United States. So again, might not mean as much here, but in the US, people have fixated on 1619. Why? Because it's the first time enslaved Africans are brought to Virginia. And so that's the start of slavery. But if you say that's the start of slavery, you overlook all this other pre-1619 enslavement and abduction and captivity of Native people. So that's part of what I'm trying to challenge, that the history of Native slavery starts the moment Columbus comes. He's really the first in slavery. He takes back almost 30 people to Spain, proposes to have a large-scale slave trade of Native people back to Europe to pay for colonization, which is rejected, but still, it inaugurates really half a century of enslavement by the Spanish, by the Portuguese, of Native people all over the Caribbean, in Brazil. And so the English think they want to do something different, but they don't. They come and do a lot of the same activity. And even the early explorers before 1620 in New England, so before Plymouth is officially founded, are kidnapping Native people from the coastlines. There's even some slightly larger scale ones in 1614. Tisquantum is a part of a small slave raid of 27 Wampanoag people that are taken back to Spain and attempted to sell them into slavery. Tisquantum, or Squanto, is famous for American children because we're taught that when the Pilgrims arrive in 1620, Squanto greets them and says, "Hello, my name is Squanto." And no one asked, well, why could he speak English? And the reason is because he was sold into slavery in Spain, escaped, went to England, and guided a group back and could speak English when the Pilgrims arrived. And the Pilgrims settle on his own homelands, his very town that had been sort of vacated because of disease. So it's a crazy story, but the slavery part and the slave raiding gets left out of it. So that's a really important part of even the beginning of this process. I want to highlight here a Mashpee Wampanoag exhibit that has been on display in different places over the years about these early stories, and just really give credit to Paula Peters and Robert Peters too and Smoke Signals for designing and promoting this history in this way. It's a really powerful exhibit. All right, so I think just to get to Bermuda for a second, I think it's helpful to think about sort of the origins, which everyone in this room knows better than I do, but just to say it, this accidental discovery of Bermuda with a shipwreck in 1609, which leads to the colony being founded in 1612. Positions, and this is from the lovely mural at the National Museum of Bermuda, which is that back stairway, which is so awesome. I hope to be there tomorrow to soak in some of the artwork. But this moment actually places Bermuda at the center of this rather incredible Atlantic English trade, privateering, and commerce. And I want you to, I'll show this image again later on, but I just want you to hold this in mind, because this is a view of Bermuda that I think some other scholars have talked about in different kinds of trade, but I want to put Bermuda at the center of an indigenous slave trade in the Atlantic. That is really the story I'm trying to paint here early on. So English privateers had circled the Atlantic even before there were official colonies in the 1580s, 1590s, early 17th century. But when Virginia gets founded in 1609, and especially Bermuda in 1609, 1612, this becomes the base for all this privateering activity. It eventually gets eclipsed by Barbados and then Jamaica, but for half a century at least, it is the center of the privateering world in different kinds of ways. And the first enslaved people, or at least, well, yeah, I'm behind my slides here. The first enslaved people who were brought in 1616, famously described here or depicted in this painting, again from the National Museum, are oyster divers, right? You can see both an African and indigenous person diving down. But so this network, just by the way, also is how Virginia gets first enslaved Africans as well. And you know where the merchant Daniel Elfrith was sailing out of? Bermuda. So it goes from Bermuda down to the Caribbean, sacks a Portuguese ship, brings back enslaved Africans first to Virginia and then to Bermuda, sells the rest of them. So Bermuda is really the center of all these different kinds of activities in a powerful way. There's so many examples from the early records, but just one small example in 1645, this guy Bartholomew Preston sells 40 Spanish Indians in Bermuda, taken in a raid against the Spanish at some unknown point in time. So this Caribbean indigenous slave trade that Bermuda was at the center of, the Caribbean was just one of the possible sources of natives being brought to Bermuda. And I want to mention others just very, very quickly. The first, obviously, is the Pequot War from 1636, 1637. This is a really important war in New England in which English colonists waged truly a genocidal war against the Pequots. I mean, they really tried to erase them from the earth. And in a treaty in 1638, at the Treaty of Hartford, they actually mandate that nobody can even speak the name of Pequot again. It's really stunning. So I use the word genocidal because I think it was a genocide. And genocides don't have to be complete or successful to be genocide, right? But it doesn't work. The Pequots obviously are still around. There's the Eastern Pequot, Massachusetts Pequot today. But as a result, there are more than 300 Pequots. Typically, most of them are shipped up around to Boston and sold into slavery. But some officials in Bermuda hear about this, and they actually write to the governor of Massachusetts Bay and say, hey, we heard there's some Pequot slaves available. Can you send some to us? And so this leads to an attempt by Captain William Pierce in his ship The Desire from Salem to ship 17 Pequot captives down to Bermuda. He missed Bermuda, which I've never tried to sail Bermuda. I imagine it's quite hard in the 17th century. But instead, he goes the whole way down here to Providence Island, which is a Puritan outpost deep in the Spanish Caribbean, sells those 17 Pequots, buys enslaved Africans instead, brings them back and sells them in Boston. But there's many, many other stories that have been passed down through the generations, also hints in the archives, even before we get to this guy, sorry, I'll come back to him. But even without looking at oral histories on the Bermuda side, there's a lot of oral history, I would say, on the white New England side that leads to later historians talk about how dozens and dozens, up to 80 Pequots, one historian says in the 18th century says, were shipped to Bermuda. So I say this to say that one of the things I encountered, and you probably have as well, people who really want to see that the hard evidence in the archive of an exact ship leaving, an exact ship arriving, the archives doesn't always give that kind of clarity. The records are incomplete. People didn't write stuff down. For example, this shipment here We only know about this because the governor of New England wrote about it in his journal. So the archives themselves, the shipping records, don't even tell us about this shipment, right? So surely there were others, because we have it later on. People talk about this for generations on both sides of the Atlantic. So I just want to, again, reaffirm, this is one of those places where the archive it's okay for me that the archive doesn't have a shipment record, because there's so many other things we know about from secondary kinds of contexts. Anyway, I think it's an important point, because the archives don't have to tell us everything. They can't anyway. And this isn't my story to tell, but there are lots of oral histories about how Jacob Miners, who's a mixed race Pequot, who's in Bermuda, is sort of one of the figureheads of a lot of present-day Bermudians who claim Pequot ancestry. And again, if you want to read more about that, you could look at the work that Brinke has done and other people as well in the room. But it's just important to mention that. So I also want to talk about King Philip's War. This is another source of natives to Bermuda. King Philip's War was a massive war of resistance by New England natives against colonization. All but several nations rose up against the English to try to sort of stop English colonization, honestly. And after a very bloody suppression that included not just sort of official soldiers, but mercenaries out in woods and fields and forests collecting Wampanoag and Nipmuc and Narragansett people and rounding them up and shipping them off into slavery. And not just people who are fighting. One of the astonishing things about this war is that even New England natives who surrendered to local authorities were also sent away into slavery or enslaved locally. So even surrendering wouldn't prevent you from being enslaved. But part of this involves local enslavement in New England, and another 1,000 natives were shipped out into different parts of the Atlantic. And I don't know if you can see way in the back there, but there's little dots all over the screen. You can see them? Okay. So those are places where I and other people have traced where New England natives were sent and sold into slavery. So France and Tangier in North Africa and the Azores and even Mexico. There's this amazing story of 15 to 20 New England natives being sent to Mexico to cut down trees, the logwood trade, the dyewood trade. And as soon as they were out in the forest, being forced to cut down trees, they killed their overseer and headed north back home. And no one knows that they got there, but it's kind of an amazing story. But also, you'll notice Bermuda, right? So there's a lot of documentation in a way around this. And this includes 3 different laws that were passed by 3 of the main North Atlantic and Caribbean islands, English islands, Bermuda, Barbados, and Jamaica, all passed. Each of them separately passed a law prohibiting the importation of Indians, of Native Americans. Bermuda was interesting because it actually seemingly banned the importation of all enslaved people. Like, it was kind of a crisis. You had New England natives being shipped there, and they were worried about them because they saw them as being dangerous and rebellious, so-called. So Bermuda just shuts down all importation of slaves for a little bit. Barbados is more targeted, and Jamaica, they both say from New England. So no New England slaves can be brought into either Barbados or Jamaica. This, by the way, is from the Bermuda archives. I'm happy to say we just found this today. I mean, people knew about it. I just didn't have a picture of it, so we tracked it down in the archives, which is really neat. But you can see the language here. A law for making all Negroes, Indians, and mulattoes that shall be brought to the island be forfeited. You have to give them up. And sometimes they were sent away. Sometimes they were claimed by the company, actually. Very interesting. And there's also lots of local lore in New England, in New England as well as in Bermuda, about King Philip's wife and son being sent to Bermuda specifically as well. So another piece of this too. Quickly, just a couple other sources that might not be as familiar to you. So there's several wars in Virginia called the Anglo-Powhatan Wars. 1622, 1644. And after each of these wars, local Powhatans are rounded up and also sent out into the Atlantic as slaves. In 1622, they're probably, some of them are being sent to Bermuda, I imagine. 1644 maybe as well. So I haven't found, lots of archival evidence, but like it seems like this is a part of this orbit for sure, because we know these captains were back and forth all the time. Another surprising location is New Netherland, which is now New York. Back then was a Dutch colony. And in Governor Keith's War in the 1640s, there's a shipment to Bermuda of at least one enslaved indigenous person, perhaps even more. And he's specifically sent as a gift from the governor of New Netherland to the governor of Bermuda. So again, another sort of surprising source in a way. Another source, yet again, is the Carolina indigenous slave trade. This is a massive slave trade that takes place out of the Carolinas in between 1680 and 1620. This guy, Alan Gillay, has estimated as many 51,000 natives in the region were taken captive and either enslaved locally or sent abroad. And what's interesting is we know that there's a lot of natives being captured and sold into slavery, but the shipping records are almost silent. It's really crazy. Like native people who are enslaved disappear into the broader population of enslaved people. But at one point, as many enslaved natives are being shipped out of Charleston, South Carolina, as enslaved Africans are being brought in. It was a really, really large process. And quickly, it was a little bit like the West African slave trade, because what happened is the English would arm coastal native nations and have them raid the interior nations and bring captives out to sell into slavery. So kind of mirrored the African slave trade in that way. We have multiple references in the Bermuda archives of Carolina indigenous people being present or sometimes turned away. There's a whole ship of enslaved natives from Carolina that was turned away in 1679 based upon that law they passed. And then in 1692, there's the probate records of Richard Jennings, who was a longtime merchant and trader. And in his probate records is mentioned a Carolina Indian man, slave, or servant. So we know that, again, the archives in terms of the shipping records and sales just don't tell the whole story. One final source of this wider indigenous slave trade that could have affected Bermuda is what I've called the Mosquito Shore indigenous slave trade. So the Mosquito Shore was this 500 stretch mile of white sand beaches in present-day Nicaragua and Honduras. And it was very similar to the Carolinas. The English would arm native nations, the Mosquito, on the coast and have them raid actually not just to the interior, not just to Spanish settlements and actually Spanish mission towns, but also up to the Yucatan and down to Panama. And they also were hunting turtles at the same time. So the English would pay high rates for turtles and indigenous slaves, and they would bring both and sell them. But Mosquito captured natives get sent to North America, to Barbados, to Jamaica, surely to Bermuda as well. We just don't really have any concrete records of that. So again, I hope that this is clear that Bermuda is at the center of this for most of the 17th century, if not beyond. It's hard to know how many enslaved natives were brought. Because of the records, it's impossible to really tabulate. But in 1700, approximately, perhaps as many as 400 to 500 of the 2,400 enslaved people on the island were indigenous, which is a pretty high percentage, maybe 10 to 20%. Many of them near or around St. David's, of course, but other parts of the island too. So I want to shift, and I'm sorry, I know this is heavy. I don't mean to sound just kind of like blowing through this history. I'm just trying to get some of the context out. But I want to linger for a little bit on the questions of what was life like for enslaved indigenous people who were trafficked to Bermuda in this time period. basically, they were doing all the same things that the wider enslaved population were doing. They worked on households, on plantations, on ships, on the docks. Some had specialized skills, whether in trades, serving as pilots or agricultural laborers. Again, this is from the National Museum of Bermuda. There's some small examples of individuals who are purchased for very specific kinds of skills that they contribute to a particular plantation. James Stirrup, for example, purchased an Indian woman named Nall, who was known to be good with cotton and weaving cotton. So some very specified or specific kinds of things. Native people were legally the property of enslavers, people who purchased them. And we see this through these bills of sale in the archives, where white colonists bought and sold natives. Here's one example from July of 1646, when Mary and Joan were bought by John Stowe. And it talks about, where he takes them and a little bit about the context of the plantation, even a little bit. There's no indication about what they were forced to do on Stowe's plantation, but if we know from other contexts that it could be anything from domestic sort of household labor to field labor. African women and enslaved women were central often to a lot of field labor on the plantation as well. What is interesting too is that it's well known that the processes of trafficking people into slavery was dehumanizing. It stripped them of their name and tribal association or kingdom association, languages, kinship networks. And sometimes you see this even with other records, right? Like Mary and Joan, they weren't born with the names Mary and Joan, of course. But in other cases, you see Native people who aren't even named at the time of the sale. There's no name recorded. There's a blank, I don't know if you can see that, a blank in the record for a space for a name, and there's not even the dignity of a name given, even if it's one assigned. So this is a bill of sale from 1645 where there's no name given at all for this person. Again, just an example of the dehumanization of this as well. And by the way, this is interesting to me too. So this is like a signature mark, right? And often you see this for people of color, indigenous people who are signing treaties or something. But in this case, this is a white enslaver in Bermuda who also is sort of uneducated and can't even sign his own name. So he signs a mark, and then the person who's taking this down writes his name on either side. Just kind of an interesting little detail, I think, about what the archives can tell us about who's doing the purchasing in a way. So Native people in Bermuda were often, if not almost always, enslaved for life as well, just like enslaved Africans. But sometimes there's this tricky language that's used that you might have seen or heard about. So there's examples of this phrase where they say a servant, first of all, servant, 19 years, if he or she shall so long live, which is just kind of a crazy way to say a slave for life, right? I mean, 99 years back in the 17th century, you're not living that long typically. And they acknowledge that by if they shall so long live. So the question is why? Like, why would they go to this effort of hiding slavery? And I think it's partly this way that Bermudians and you don't really see this anywhere else I've noticed, but like that people can feel like they're doing something other than slavery by calling it servitude and by placing a time on it. So it's just servitude. But it really was functional slavery. There's a few other cases where there is a time limit attached of 7 years or something like that. But we found other evidence in New England where even what we call term slavery or term limited slavery could easily become slavery for life functionally. Because who's going to track you down and force you to comply, right? And there's actually court cases in the 18th century, New England natives sue for their freedom and they say, hey, my mom was supposed to serve for 7 years after King Philip's War, and she was never freed. I came along, I was enslaved, and now I'm an adult and I want my freedom. It's kind of powerful. So we know that short-term slavery became long-term slavery. Here's another example of this 19 years. This is an Indian man named George. Yeah, if you can kind of see it here. So anyway, all very, very interesting. Another piece of this, obviously, is that you have Native people who are forced here, but they find a way to build new communities, new networks, new families. And this is, I think, a really important part of the story, is that Native people don't just come and accept sort of the dehumanization, as they specifically rebuild connections and networks. So, for example, here we have in December 1679, there's two enslaved natives named Joan and Peter who are accused of having a child out of wedlock, right? Often it took the permission of enslavers to sort of have relationships. Sometimes people just went rogue and built families on the side, and then sometimes got caught. There's other cases, though, and I find this specific case so moving. Instances where you have a man and an enslaved native man and woman who want to get married. And the enslavers agree to it, they get permission, but they put in place a contract that every child would get split between each enslaver and belong to them. And so that's bad enough, right? But also, there's a subsequent paper trail of contracts that stipulate that the grandchildren of that couple will also be split between the two enslavers. So Bermuda enslavers, this is early, 1651, like the law in Virginia in 1662 that sort of mandates that the children of enslaved people will also, the children of enslaved women will also be enslaved. That phrase, parta sequitur ventrum, I'm not sure if you've heard that before, but means the condition of the child follows the mother. So it's a mechanism for sort of the reproduction of slavery through biological reproduction. But this is before that law. It's in operation in Bermuda very early, but there's nothing on the laws that I've seen that makes this legal. It's just the planters just do it. The enslavers just do it. So this idea that Bermuda planters or enslavers are looking into the future and imagining the grandchildren being split back and forth, I think is just quite stunning and sobering and really powerful. Finally, there's examples in the archives of Native people fighting back, which I think we all are looking for at some place here. And this is just a pretty famous case. Brinke writes about this, other people as well. Indian John, in the records he's called, likely from New England, possibly Wampanoag, who basically concocts a plot to get a gun, lure the family out of the house by setting it on fire, and then when they come out, to shoot them all, which is pretty bold. He gets caught and actually dreadfully executed, beheaded, drawn and quartered. Parts of his body are displayed around Bermuda to try to warn other people against such activity. But I'm always, I know it's violent, but I'm always cheering for these people in the archives, honestly, when you find them. So there's a little bit of a mystery in the archives. After 1700, actually more like 1720, I guess I would say, there's very, very few mention of specifically people termed Indian in the archives. And there's lots of reasons. Well, I guess the reason here is that enslavers stopped marking them as Indian. It doesn't mean that they're not there, though, at all. And part of, I think, the reason why is that owning enslaved Native people was coming under greater scrutiny. And we see this in 1698, where the Board of Trade in London writes the Bermuda governor and says, hey, we hear there's a lot of enslaved Native Americans in Bermuda, and we would like a full accounting of how they were brought in, from where. And it's interesting, it says, upon observation made that it is commonly said there are many Americans, they call them Americans, but the margin says America Indian slaves. So they clarify what they mean in the margins. So this letter gets sent, guess what happens? absolutely nothing. And I think this is part of why enslavers in Bermuda stopped keeping track of Native people and why the race is sort of shifted into just slave or black or Negro or mulatto. There are other records later on after this point that reference indigeneity, but it becomes less and less common. So in the 18th century, this language morphs to colored, away from Indian or indigenous. And again, I think that this terminology of colored, which you find also later in New England, is really powerful because it just flattens sort of people and their background and histories and family networks, and especially erases indigeneity, which is really the point. These importations of indigenous people, I think, continue well into the 18th century. They're not recorded as such all the time. And another interesting development here, too, in terms of the 18th century, is that as both enslaved Native people, but also multiracial and African people begin to find their way to freedom in certain ways, whether through court cases or through purchasing their own freedom or other kinds of ways, Bermuda starts to get nervous and passes a law in 1727 to expel them out of Bermuda. So, it's an increasingly narrowing sort of place socially that people of color, indigenous people, can play within the system in many ways. This law isn't successful because you have in the archives many, many examples of free, they call them people of color, but free indigenous, free African people who are in Bermuda into the 18th century, early 19th century. They own property. Sometimes they actually own other enslaved people. Very, very powerful. But again, despite these erasures, I just want to again highlight that these family stories, these family histories contained and retained these kinds of histories and family connections that the archives stopped keeping track of. If we fast forward to emancipation, we can see a little bit of this as well. So these are the slave registries from 1834. As you probably know, the reason for these registries is so that enslavers could be compensated for the loss of having to free enslaved people that was paid out by the British government. So again, if you are a Bermuda slave owner, you're not going to say Indian. Because guess how much you get compensated for that from the British government, right? Zero. So there's all these colored enslaved people listed in Bermuda registries, which I think is in sharp distinction from what we see elsewhere, even in other registries from Bermuda that say Negro. So they know the difference, right? They're not all the same. And I think this is one way to think about the presence of multiracial indigenous people even at the time of emancipation, obviously, as well. And there's lots of stories which Brinke and other people, and actually I would add this book by Elaine Fox here, if this is from the 20th century, but still a wonderful book on Bermuda's history. But there's really great stories that Brinke and other people tell, the oral stories, oral histories that come out about the experiences that families retell about experiencing emancipation, life after emancipation, settling as free people in St. David's Islands, building those networks, building those communities for generations as well. And so my book sort of tapers off at about this point. So you have to pick up Brinke's book or other scholarship or talk to people in the room to get that full history. But it is fascinating that there is a very clear thread through this whole period if we're willing to trace it, I think. So the second half of my book deals with the U.S., but I just want to touch on a few things that I think might be of interest to think about the parallel. First of all, before the United States is founded, the first anti-slavery society in the English colonies as a whole is actually founded to free an indigenous woman in Pennsylvania. So Dinah Neville's her name. She's Lenape. She's brought to Philadelphia to be sold to somebody else. She has 4 children. In Philadelphia, she petitions for her freedom. It's actually denied. It's a sad story. She receives her freedom later on. But I want to show you this striking image. This is a painting of Dinah Neville made by Jeremiah Paul in 1795. And she is clearly portrayed as an Indigenous woman. It's really, really striking. Even more striking if you compare it to this image, which was used throughout the sort of American and also British Empire. At the bottom it says, "Am I not a man and a brother?" Right? So this sort of abolitionist, anti-slavery image. We know this one, right? But we don't know this one, an enslaved Indigenous woman receiving her freedom. So the contrast between the two images, I think, is really striking. Native Americans, I don't have a slide for this, but after the Revolutionary War, a lot of Native Americans in the US sue for their freedom. So there's a huge spike in freedom suits in the 18 teens and 20s. But one of I have a chapter in the book that talks about how Native Americans were present on Southern plantations in ways that we've overlooked because many Native Americans were just re-raced and erased in terms of their identity because they're multiracial often and just listed in plantation records as black. But we have oral histories from later on that talk about Native people being trafficked as part of the internal slave trade, being on Southern plantations, being sold at these huge Southern auctions where enslaved people were brought from the Old South to the New South and sold into slavery. And Indigenous people were part of all of these processes in powerful ways. When the United States begins to colonize westward, it causes a huge spike in Indigenous slavery as well, including the supposedly free state of California. And newspapers at the time published a whole list of Native children who were indentured for up to age 25. And it's because of these 2 laws that are passed in 1850 and 1860. So California is a free state, right? But you have all of these Native children that are being indentured repeatedly and probably never being freed. It actually is such a huge phenomenon that the United States Congress has to pass a separate law after the Civil War to specifically outlaw Native American peonage. It's really, really striking. Boarding schools here, again, a really striking part of US and Canadian, Australian, New Zealand history, where this is Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania. Just hundreds of Native kids are funneled through here to be assimilated, to not speak their language anymore, to dress sort of not indigenously, to have their hair cut, everything else. Excuse me, but actually labor was central to the boarding schools. So they would be in the classroom for half the day and then work for half the day, 6 hours in each space. And many Native children were also sent out into white homes in what was called the outing system, where they would be forced to go for an entire summer to a white home to labor for free, or even to work in local factories for a very, very, very small amount of money. So that's why this is in the book, because the labor component is such a strong piece of this. And then finally, just to talk about adoptions. In the United States, up to 70,000 Native children were put into adoption and fostering programs. The Mormons, the Church of Latter-day Saints, was a big part of this, but the federal government, state agencies also did this as well. And by 1960, Native leaders realized that 1/3 of Native children were either in boarding schools or adopted into white homes. 1/3. So again, back to the idea of stealing. Like, this was often done through different kinds of coercive methods. State agents, social workers would come onto Native lands, see the poverty of reservations, not see 2 parents, and take the child before a judge and say that the child was either an orphan or wasn't properly cared for. And then the child was taken away from the family. So this happens by the thousands across the US. What I think is powerful, and this is where the book ends, is that Native nations eventually band together and petition Congress repeatedly to return sovereignty, to return their children, and to have acts like the Indian Child Welfare Act passed in 1978, which allowed Native nations to educate their own children, but more importantly, to have a say in where their children were placed for adoption or not to be placed at all. So a series of congressional acts that help protect Native people. All right, I know I'm going too long here, I apologize, but I'm wrapping up. So I want to just think about the legacies of these histories. And one of them, I think, is this really incredible multiracial population in Bermuda, right? And there's a distinct sort of indigenous ancestry from a wide variety of places, including New England. And I think that's really powerful and also something that can be celebrated, I think, in different ways. Even I know that there's probably challenges that come with that as well. Another legacy, of course, is the St. David's Committee and the Reconnection Committee, and also the powwows that happen every other year since 2002. This is a powerful coming together, as I mentioned before, that I think is such a testimony to the recovery of these histories. And I just want to read briefly, this is a statement from Dawn Dove, who's Narragansett, who talks about these reconnections, and I think it's just really powerful as a way to sort of end. She says, "The historical trauma that my people suffer is great. We did not inflict this upon ourselves. This is the direct result of the theft of our land, the enslavement and indenture of my people by the colonizers. As a child, I was always told that we have relatives in Bermuda as a result of the enslavement of our people by the colonizers." She also down here says, "The historical trauma lives in the hearts and minds of the Narragansett today. As we walk on our God-given homeland, we can see how the colonizers, through their greed and corruption, have stolen our birthright." And she goes on to say that these histories weigh heavily on the Narragansetts, as I know they do on descendant communities today as well. And so just to have, for me as a non-native scholar researcher, to have those perspectives always in front of me, that you don't get in the archives, not the official governmental archives, is really, really powerful. Final legacy, maybe, I know very little about the Gombeys, but I know that there is sort of a joint kind of history, which is really amazing. I know that there's people working on this, Dora Haas, for example. Anyway, a really fascinating sort of unique legacy, I think, that has come out of this. I will close with just telling you about a project I've been working on that has been in collaboration with Native nations in New England to try to create a public database for records relating to Native American slavery. So I'd encourage you, if you have a chance, to look it up, stolenrelations.org. It's created in collaboration with these tribal nations. It's actually around 8,000 records now, but it's not just history. This is what's really neat. When you collaborate with Native people, they say, look, this is still, like, past and present are all the same, right? So we have really neat interviews from contemporary tribal members, some of whom you'd recognize, I think. Artwork, music, poetry that we've commissioned, because this is also a way of processing these histories in communities. And I will say there is a lot of Bermuda stuff in this database as well. So feel free to check it out and let me know what you think. And thank you for your time and attention.
All right, well, thank you very much, Linford. That was great. Gave us a lot to think about, put Bermuda in perspective of sort of the wider Native American, Indigenous trade. And yeah, that was great. We have a few minutes for any questions. Any hands? All right, I'll prime the pump. Everyone just wants to get downstairs to the wine. So to bring it back to sort of St. David's, in your research, are there many communities, I'm thinking more in the Caribbean, that have sort of held on to that Native American part of themselves, or has it sort of faded away a bit more than in Bermuda?
Yeah. I would say this is the strongest example that I have encountered. I do know, I've been in touch with some people in Jamaica who are organizing sort of Taino kinds of communities as well. Some of that has come out of the so-called maroon towns up in the hills of Jamaica. And I know that I was at a conference a number of years ago where I talked to a scholar who was from one of those maroon towns, and I know DNA testing is horrible and whatever else, controversial, but he, as a resident of that town, was working with a geneticist to do better kinds of thorough testing. Anyway, my point is, like, he was a part of a movement that was saying these are not just enslaved Africans up in the hills. These are also Taino communities, and we need to recognize that. Barbados, maybe a little bit less, but Barbados's history is much like Bermuda, in that there was not at the time of English takeover, not a resident indigenous population. So all the enslaved people who are indigenous, who are on Barbados or were on Barbados, had to be brought elsewhere, just like they were to Bermuda. There's other pockets of that, but Jamaica comes across as maybe the biggest parallel. Yeah.
Yep, there's back there. Michelle?
Thank you. Have you considered the Freemasonry angle? Because the Freemasons and also our first privateer, the Rich family, or I won't say that, Earl of Warwick, they were Huguenots, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, which wouldn't have been agreeable with slavery. And secondly, they were looking for other places to be and drove colonization because of the religious wars. Especially when Philip of Spain married.
Right.
So I'm wondering if you looked at those, because you may not realize Bermuda had all of the Freemasons. They're the Scottish, the Irish, and the British here.
That's fascinating.
In like the US or other islands in France, and they were all separated out.
Interesting.
So I'm wondering if because I think when the slave ship came in, sorry, it's a long time away from me. It was the Freemasons of George and St. George that nailed things and said no.
Yeah, I mean, I have to confess that wasn't like a primary lens. You sort of bump into it here and there, but I guess my initial response would be to say, like, I wouldn't be surprised at all if there was intermingling and overlay, but because this is happening everywhere, I mean, unless everything is being controlled by the Freemasons, it's a much larger phenomenon. Yeah.
In America during the Maritimes. But I'm just interested to know
Yeah.
if you considered any of that. Clearly it's crossed your mind.
Yeah.
From my research, I was quite astounded at some of the standings that they took and how they managed some of the more powerful players on the island.
I'd be happy to be in touch. Would love to learn more. Yes, it's really neat to hear that you're pursuing that angle. Thank you.
As you delve into creating this book,
Yeah.
you notice that there's a lot of information.
Hmm.
So my question to you now is, are you looking at another book? Continue on with your research.
Well, so it's only been out a month or two, so I need to take a little break. So what I'm most interested in next is thinking about how people in olden times, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century, knew about water and water travel. So I love to sail, and I always think about the way in which people, indigenous people, right, people in the Caribbean, African coast, I mean, people knew things that I think are invisible to us today in a way. And so the kind of, not just like, the tides and currents and depth, but also like other things that I think have become invisible because things deteriorate. So just even the mechanisms or the methods or the kinds of watercraft, and there's little snippets here and there. There's these great stories of, in the Caribbean, the wind blows, I think it's east to west, right? And so getting from one island west to east in a sailboat. For those of you who sail a big 16th century ship, you're like, it's, half a day back and forth. And indigenous people with these huge canoes, or not even canoes, boats of like 80 people could just row across in a heartbeat. You know what I mean? So just a lot of interesting stories that I'd love to think more about, just because I love the water. And so if I'm lucky, maybe Bermuda will play a part in that as well.
I just wanted to add to that because when we did the reconnection, there's so many comparisons between turtling, whaling,
Neat.
boat floating between
Yeah.
people of the East Coast and Bermuda.
That's cool.
Specifically in St. David's,
Yeah.
where we had many connections. And just take a small thing, building nets, the same knot is being used.
Oh, that's
in
fascinating.
as well as
Yeah.
in that area. So
That's cool.
yes, we agree.
Yeah. So maybe actually a really nice inspiration. So maybe in like 20 years, I'll be giving a talk and saying, I was at this talk, Maria, and somebody gave me But like the idea of not just water travel, but also sort of relationships and interconnections with things in the water, right? So fishing and so forth. That's a really, I like that. Yeah. Thank you.
We'll go with the gentleman first.
Hello. I recently read a remarkable book whose title I am blanking on at the moment about the incredible communication system between enslaved people in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
Under enslavement, crossing languages and all these
Yeah.
things, and how constantly confounded the enslavers. I'm just curious if there's any evidence of that with the First Nations population here, communicating either with other enslaved populations or perhaps back and forth with people on the continent. Unlikely, but I don't know if there's any evidence of that.
Yeah. There's all kinds of reports in almost all these contexts in the Caribbean of a sort of both outside of enslavement, like a trade language that develops, but I think a pidgin is what we sort of often call it. Like, I think a version of that occurs among enslaved populations, not just even indigenous, different groups, but also like within African, enslaved African communities as well. But again, these are part of the invisible kinds of things that are not tabulated in the archive. I mean, where we see this the most is when you have prosecutions for suspected slave revolts. You bring people in and you interrogate them all, and then, execute a bunch of people. But like in those interrogations is where you capture these little communication patterns. And I know within indigenous populations more generally, even among communities who were regionally based but had different language bases, would communicate in other ways as well, or at least symbolically communicate. So like in the Southeast, I mentioned the Carolina indigenous slave trade. The Yamasee War in 1715, 1716 was organized by Native nations passing around strings with knots on it that counted down the days, right? So they could probably communicate in other ways, but it's interesting to think about material ways of communicating in Bermuda, other places, among plantations as well. Not only for the purpose of revolt, but also for other purposes as well, I imagine, too. So it's not a really great answer, but that's in part because the archival records aren't very great. I think you hear a lot more of that coming through oral histories of communication as well.
And Kathy?
Kind of touching on that, I know that in Bermuda there's this sense of people carrying a Galenic oral tradition of the connections. And is there also in New England a sense that there was, you mentioned this, that there was an acknowledgement of indigenous communities in Bermuda? It's something that Dr. Maxwell had talked about. About informal communications taking place because so many enslaved people were involved in seafaring and the seafaring trade in Bermuda. If there were reestablishments of ties during the period of enslavement.
It's really hard to know, and again, the archive is pretty elusive. I'm just thinking of one example in particular of, and I don't remember the year, I'm thinking it's still 17th century, of an enslaved person in Bermuda who snuck onto a ship heading to New England and then just disappeared. And so, yeah, I would 100% believe this because we know this from other kinds of networks. So within the broader sort of Atlantic trade and even slave trade economy, there's so many indigenous and African people working as sailors on ships, sometimes free and wage labor, a lot of times under certain kinds of contracts or duress or actually enslaved. And 1,000%, every time they land at a port, they're connecting in different kinds of ways and communicating. So I wish we had a sort of way of tracking this, but I fully believe that this would have been an operation in some way between New England and Bermuda and other places over time as well. It's just one of these silences, for the most part silences, that we can sort of imply, I think, and understand how that would work, but never fully know.
I think we're going to have just one more question. I just saw the gentleman right at the back.
You mentioned earlier you want to study more to travel, usually sea for communications and travel. There is a Bill Captain's Law that was found in Maritime Museum, Dr. Maxwell represented, that stated back in the 1500s there was a ship traveling to the Americas, and they came across a storm past Bermuda. And they described in the log saying they saw a sea monster. The description of it was a mulatto man or tiny Indian.
Wow.
Well, because until we knew back then, Bermuda was used as a base station for travel. That's why there's a lot of holes and birds here when the shipwreck came.
Sure.
So they were known, a lot of the Taínos were known to travel up and down
the
eastern seaboard. And this is right, I can't remember the exact date, but I know it's in the 1500s.
Wow.
It was the date of that ship's log. Actually dates that occurrence.
That's fantastic. Thank you for that. Another little tidbit to pursue. And I really appreciate that too, because I think that the way Bermuda is often talked about in the literature is that it was like always uninhabited. And I think that is, things like this help to sort of reframe that. And like Barbados, just because Europeans find it in a certain state doesn't mean that that's the only state it's ever been in. I think that's a really big fallacy that academics often have, honestly, but also just humans as well. Thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Then I'll probably end it with sort of a question/statement. I
Sure.
thought it was interesting when you showed the slide with that indigenous people were sent to the Azores as well.
Oh, yeah.
Presumably from Brazil and the Portuguese being there. But then just, 100 or 200 years later, Azorean immigration to Bermuda. And
True.
just how, the world was a big place, but people were moving around a lot, and there was a lot of intermingling for pretty much as long as people have been around. So I thought that connection was really interesting as well.
That's cool. Thanks. I hadn't put that together, but that's really a neat thought.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much again, and we'll get one more round of applause, please.
Thank you. Oh. Wow.
Dr. Fisher,
That's so
thank you
nice.
so much from the Department of Libraries and Archives for coming and talking to us about your book.
Thank you so much. You're welcome.
You're most welcome.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Yeah.
All right, and then we have some refreshments downstairs in the Historical Society, and Dr. Fisher will also be signing and selling his books, I believe.
Yes.
Yep. Alrighty.
That was lovely. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate it. What was your name?
Ranjay Dembro.
Ranjay Dembro. Nice to meet you.
You as well. Thank you again.
Okay. See ya.
Yeah.